Well, hey, what's up, everybody? What's up, YouTube? Pastor Matt here. Hey, since it is the end of the year, 2018, I thought it'd be really cool to look back at all the books that I read this year. Not necessarily all the books that were published this year, but all the ones that I read, and I'll talk about each one of them for about 2 seconds. So here we go. I started off with John Calvin, A Little Book on the Christian Life. This is a new translation by Burk Parsons and somebody else. It's part of the Institutes. Then I read The Meaning and Mode of Baptism by Jay Adams, which argues for baptism by pouring. Then I read The Chronicles of Narnia, The Silver Chair with my daughter Simone. We're working through the whole series. I don't do a lot of fiction, but I did read this one. And then Jonathan Edwards, The Nature of True Virtue. This is his philosophical piece where he argues for a concept called benevolence to being in general, which is essentially loving God above all things and loving everyone else. That's his philosophical work. Then I read Jonathan Edwards on The Good Life. This is part of a multi-part series edited by Owen Strawn and Douglas Sweeney. And then Luther's Small Catechism. I didn't read this entire book, just the actual stuff written by Martin Luther. It's a wonderful catechism in the Lutheran tradition. Then I read Tales of the Greek Heroes by Roger Lancelyn Green, a good introduction. It's kind of for juveniles, actually. Has a lot of pictures and whatnot, but a good introduction to Greek mythology. The Hobbit, another fictional work, one of the classics of literature. If you haven't read The Hobbit, do yourself a favor and do so. Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms. Again, I didn't read all three. This has the confession in both catechisms. I just read the shorter catechism this year, although I've studied all of them, of course, before. A Brief History of Thought is an introduction to philosophy by Luke Ferry. This is a non-Christian work, but nevertheless a good introduction to philosophy. Three Forms of Unity. If you're not a Westminster guy, maybe you're a Heidelberg Catechism guy, and so I read the Heidelberg Catechism again this year. Form of Presbyterial Church Governments and Westminster Directory of Public Worship. Those are all other documents that the Westminster Divines put together in addition to the Confession and Catechisms. The Authorized Version, A Wonderful and Unfinished History. This is a little book by C.P. Callahan arguing for the goodness and importance of the King James. C.S. Lewis, The World's Last Night and Other Essays, short little essays by Lewis, good stuff. Protestant Reformation, Returning to the Word of God, again by C.P. Callahan, goes with the other one on the King James Version. Treatise on Jonathan Edwards by S. Mark Hamilton on continuous creation and Christology. Looking at Philosophy, The Unbearable Heaviness of Philosophy Made Lighter. Really funny work, has a lot of pictures, but a good introduction to philosophy, usually used by freshmen in college. I think this is actually the first book I read in 2018. This is Perspectives on the Sabbath, 4 Views, 4 different authors arguing for different positions on the Sabbath day or the Lord's Day. The Consequences of Ideas by R.C. Sproul, another introduction to philosophy. That was a theme that I read through earlier in the year. When God Spoke Greek, this is on the Septuagint edition of the Bible, which is, of course, the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek. The Pastor as Public Theologian by Owen Strawn and Kevin Van Hooser argues for the pastor's importance as articulating a theological vision for the church and the community. The Triune God by Fred Sanders. This is a good introduction to the doctrine of the Trinity. The Marrow of Theology by William Ames, a classic Puritan work used by many of the Puritans while they were training for the ministry. Theoretical Practical Theology by Petrus Van Mastricht. This is what Jonathan Edwards read, his favorite theological doctrinal systematic work. This is volume 1. The rest of the volumes are going to come out in the future. They're not out yet, not yet translated into English. And finally, the Hebrew first primer as I work through the Hebrew language. So that's what I read this year. Bunch of good books. What did you read this year? I'd like to know what you read this year. Tell me in the comments of this video what you read. I hope you enjoyed some of these. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll put some of my favorite books that I read this year as links in the description so you can hop over to Amazon and maybe grab a couple of them for yourself. All right, love you lots. Thanks for checking in. Talk to you later.